I've got 10 LEDs on it, and believe it or not, I'm getting all this power to light those LEDs from an antenna. This radio has no battery and it has no plug. And if I tune it just right, those lights are incredibly bright. I measured the power going to the lights, and I got about 5 milliamps going in there. And I don't know what the voltage is, but it's the lights require about 3.6 volts to light up. So you got to figure it's got to be higher than that, because I've got 10 LEDs.
Cardinal Matt Staader from the Ecumenical Order of Christ. Thank you for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Today you want to talk about ancient technologies and the connection to a worldwide ancient civilization.
Yeah.
Also known as Tartaria.
That is one term applied to it. It's
Atlantis.
Atlantis, I think, was an earlier civilization that was destroyed long before. I
But
could be wrong on that.
There's some people that draw the connection to these.
There's very possibly, could be that the people that created Tartaria were descended from survivors of the destruction of Atlantis. That's very, very plausible. But the actual nation of Tartaria is essentially what we know as Russia, Ukraine, and much of China today. It's the clip that we opened with is very similar to things that we hear about from Nikola Tesla. But one of the things that he's most famous for is his wireless transmission of electricity, which would have provided, if he was able to complete the development of it, would have provided free electricity without any kind of transmission wires to everyone on the planet. But due to primarily greed of those who are funding his research, that was completely scrubbed.
So this technology, he wanted to reveal it to all of mankind.
He did, yes. He did it for his motivation. He never, in the research I've done about Tesla, he never showed any kind of inclination towards excessive greed or personal gain.
And in some ways that was kind of his downfall, because
very much
people
so.
like Thomas Edison capitalizes on a lot of his work.
Thomas Edison is credited with a lot of things that Tesla did the hard work on. Now, this image here was something that was in development when the funding that Tesla was receiving from J.P. Morgan, it was completely scrapped, the whole project, before it could be completed. And this would have been the first of a network of transmission towers, which could have transmitted power even to a moving vehicle on the road, like electrically driven, no need for batteries, anything like that, just a receiver to pick up the transmission.
So it's similar to the technology that the man was portraying in the video earlier.
I think that's a primitive form of when I say primitive, I'm not trying to detract from what the guy is demonstrating, but it's nowhere near as developed. And he said himself, although he said, look, given that there's no battery, there's no power supply, the only thing powering those LEDs is radio waves. That's a fairly big thing. So the numbers that he gave in terms of the amperage and the voltage is tiny. The LEDs don't take much to run.
But he wasn't using something this large and nowhere near the amplification to draw that much power. But Tesla seemed to have found a way.
Well, I think, and I've been trying to figure it out for a long time, the exact scientific principles behind it, but those that wanted this hidden from the public eye did a good job. And finding definite explanations and trying to connect the dots is very difficult, but I'm fairly sure it had something to do with specific frequencies and using that to transmit high voltage.
And there were more ancient forms of this technology utilized well before our civilization.
Ancient structures, buildings that, officially speaking, were constructed much more recently, but there is evidence that they're a lot older than what we're led to believe, and all of them have these, like this example from Russia, and this is a gorgeous structure, but not all of them have the same visual appeal, but all of them have some form of these spires on the top. Like this is I think a Victorian style, I think, in England.
Just so this spire that's on top of this house here is drawing energy. Is supposed to be able to draw energy in and power what's in this home.
Yeah, it's a known fact that there is an electrical charge in the atmosphere, and it has been known for a long time. It's a matter of harnessing it and putting it to useful work.
That's phenomenal, because we see a lot of examples of this type of structure in antiquity, but even in cities left from ancient times.
All over the world, yeah. There's even examples where photos from the early 1900s of a particular building, and then more recent photos of the same thing, and in some cases, these buildings have had the domes and the spires completely removed. Now, I found this one particularly interesting. Now, we can see that this is from the city of Melbourne in Australia.
From 1888.
From 1888. Now, this building is obviously constructed primarily out of stone. On one hand, I find it interesting that there is no photos of it at all under construction. There's only photos of ironically, I don't have a photo here. This was the only image I could find that showed the whole structure. But what became the city of Melbourne was only established in 1835. And that was a penal colony from England.
So a bunch of former prisoners from England built this within 50 years with stones from where?
Now,
where would you say they got all those stones from?
There's only two possibilities. One is that they quarried the stone locally, which is the more feasible one. The other one is that they shipped it from England, which is far less likely. But
England wouldn't finance that.
Very unlikely. But it's not only the materials, it's the infrastructure, the roads necessary to transport those materials, the vehicles necessary to do it. 1800s, they still had horse and cart. But not just the infrastructure, but supply chains and skill sets of people there. And we're supposed to believe that in 53 years, or 52, because the building was actually completed the year before the Melbourne World's Fair. But in the space of 52, is that right? 35 to, yeah, that's right. 52 years, they went from stone huts, or cottages, is a better word for that, to this enormous structure. And supposedly drawing an audience from around the world is the only way you could really justify an enormous construction project like that to a place that's a 50-year-old colony.
Seems unlikely.
It does.
So there's another explanation, you think?
I think, and there is a lot of it. There is a lot of evidence, but at the same time, a lot of effort has been carried out to try and suppress it. Well, all over the world, from even the United States, Australia, Russia, England, that all of these places had abandoned buildings of advanced construction that were rediscovered in the relatively modern era.
So I realize that we're kind of skipping ahead on the order you planned here, but I just wanted to bring this up because it is relevant to the
It
context
is,
you're
yes.
talking about. We were talking about this earlier, and you can see here that there's a great amount of sediment layer that's covering up the bottoms of these structures, and you can see they're basically digging it out.
Yeah.
So that sediment, of course, is from a time from before our civilization,
When large portions of populated areas had massive mudslides sweep through them.
or it could have been submerged in water.
I don't think so. It could be. I wasn't there monitoring the weather at the time, but it could have been sediment from a flood. That is definitely a
And
feasible.
it seems very consistent with the amount of sediment layer that they're excavating from these buildings across the globe. I mean, that consistency alone would indicate that there was a common factor there.
Well, you do have a point that to move that much mud doesn't easily move on its own, especially on a flat area.
Yeah.
So to have a large quantity of water to carry it and then it's settling into a layer of mud, it is plausible.
It's really interesting. So what is the Lord said about this? I know you've spoken to him directly, right?
Not at great length. I think it's one of those things where he is not. I'm not sure whether it's that he can't yet or that
He's not allowed to.
he does have restrictions on what he can disclose to us.
Yeah.
It's either that or he is giving me the time to see how much I can figure out on my own, which he has done before with other things.
Well, hopefully he's watching this and he can offer some points in the future that we can expound on again.
Because you are asking me questions that I haven't actually thought of as possibilities for how some of these things came about.
I know you've given me a lot of photos, and I want to bring them up because I think people need to see these many examples that we're talking about here. And I'm just going to forego the scene transition here and just scroll through these and let you talk about them as you like. But
well, as we can see now, some not just the spires, but the quality of the construction. Many of these, they're just spectacular.
And you look at the people down below. We all know what kind of technology they had. It was like horse and buggy, and there wasn't. I mean, the pulley systems were kind of a new thing in those days.
Yeah. Now, a lot of these are from the 1800s. This one in particular, I believe, is a World's Fair in Paris. That one, I can't remember.
I think this is an Orthodox church in either Eastern Europe or Western Russia.
It definitely has that look to the architecture. But every single one of these, and obviously it doesn't show up as well in the black and white images, but every one of those tall structures is topped with some kind of copper antenna. Now that one there almost looks like it's in India.
Yeah, it looks like it's being renovated or something. There's ladders around it.
Yeah. That's another one in Russia, I'm fairly sure.
Have you heard of red mercury?
I have heard of it.
Now, what I've heard is that some of these structures that weren't completely renovated, that in recent times they'd found this substance they were calling red mercury within those little bulbous areas on the top.
Finding factual information about red mercury is difficult because there's videos on YouTube for one thing, and the properties that they show this stuff demonstrating, I cannot even get my head around. So you see, for example, a white saucer, like a shallow bowl, and whoever's making the video will pour some of this stuff, the red mercury. It looks just like silver mercury, but it has a clear crimson. It's not pink. It's not it is red. There's just no other word for it. and they'll swirl it around so the little bead of liquid rolls around the inside of the bowl. But they'll also have a mirror set up, and the mercury is not showing up in that mirror.
Very strange. So it's emitting, it's refracting light, but not on the right spectrum to be seen in a mirror.
That's the only logical thing I could, and it's the concept of it is that something that you can physically see is only this thing. It's
Are
reflecting
you
light.
sure it wasn't vampire blood?
It's reflecting light. The reason we can see it in the bowl on that film is because it's reflecting light into the lens of the camera.
Yeah.
So it has to be reflecting light at that mirror. And then bouncing from the mirror, it's coming back to the camera as well.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. And the only thing I can think of is somehow, after the reflected light only has, like, it can't be reflected more than once. Well, the closest thing I could come to is the concept of redshift, which is an astrological phenomenon.
Interesting.
Which is described that stars that are moving away from us, no matter what colour they are, will appear red. It's not a direct comparison. But one of the other things I was told, anyone can find this video on YouTube. It's someone gets a AA battery, and they just put a magnet on either end of it, and they drop it in a bowl of silver mercury, and this thing starts spinning around like it's a turbine in at the rotor of an electric motor.
It's wild.
Now, the only bit of information I've been given, aside from what I found myself on red mercury, is that you can do this with just a bar magnet. Just drop a bar magnet in a deep enough amount of liquid of red mercury that it won't sink in. And mercury is very dense. A lot of things will float in it, including a magnet. And it doesn't need the battery. It'll just rotate. Just the presence of that magnet in the mercury, the red mercury itself, will generate opposing magnetic charges, magnetic repulsion, basically, to make it rotate against the liquid itself.
So I just brought up an image here. You wanted me to bring this up. You said it was located somewhere in France.
This is another another part of the one in Paris. You can see the 4 spires there, and to be perfectly honest, I don't know enough about the understanding that they had of this phenomenon of harvesting energy from the atmosphere at the time to understand why they would build it the way they did here instead, unless it's a combination of artistic architecture, basically, and instead of just building one big spire, they had 4. And look at this thing. I'm sorry, it's just glorious structure.
It's just far too advanced and beautiful to be
the periods of times that the period of time that many of these things were supposedly constructed in. Even if you could assemble the skill base.
Oops.
What happened there?
That was my fault.
Okay. Even if you were to assemble the builders and the artisans and the craftsmen necessary to reproduce a structure like this today, could we build it from scratch in less than a year like these people have, or like we're told they are? Now, I did have an image of the This is the Crystal Palace, as it was known, from the World's Fair in London. And one of the things that got me, this is slightly different, not really on the transmission of energy so much, but the scale of this building. Look at the size of the people. And even on second and third floors, how high those ceilings are.
Yeah, clearly there's something else going on here. Definitely, it's definitely different than what we've been told.
From what we're told, at least in my generation, what we're told of history and what the images show is two different things. But the next image is a promotional poster for what is arguably the most famous World's Fair of all time. In the modern era, it's simply known as the Chicago World's Fair. At the time, it was known as the World's Columbian Exhibition. And I find it interesting that the number one thing that's being promoted here,
Electrical building.
yeah,
All of Mines, Wisconsin State Building.
and I'm not sure. I'm fairly sure they didn't have a hall dedicated to landmines or anything like that. I'm sure it's more like underground mining for resource extraction. But the official narrative, and probably should have started with a different image, but we can still work with this one.
You mean this one right here?
I think it's the next one.
I think that's all we have in Chicago.
That one there.
There we go.
That is all, as far as I'm aware, all of the buildings or at least the vast majority of them, that were constructed supposedly for the Chicago World's Fair. In the center of the frame, you can see just how big that statue is. And that statue in the middle of that, on that podium in the middle of the water, that is made of gold.
The design of this and the construction is immaculate.
And the official narrative says that all of these buildings are timber covered in plaster.
No way.
Now,
And you look at this and you would think, I mean, take out all the people, the little boats and all that. If you were to put just this image alone, and then what you would expect to be there, you would expect people in like Star Trek outfits and like little floating spaceships around there and stuff. That would be more fitting for what you would see there. Not these little people in top hats and their silly umbrellas and their little rowboats,
coats with tails and
riding on horseback and dodging engines with their bows and arrows. Sorry.
It's all right.
I mean, I don't apologize to the audience, but still, that's what they contended with back in those days. They had difficulty dealing with people with spears.
That's a valid point. The official narrative says that I said it before, that all of this is timber construction covered in plaster. And conveniently, almost all of this, as with every other World's Fair of that era, 1800s through to early 1900s, was almost entirely demolished after the World's Fair was over.
Why would they do such a thing?
But here's where the logic fails. One building, and I cannot recall the name of it right now, one building it's probably, I think it's that one, it's the center of the frame now, is still there. And so, while all of these things were supposedly constructed the same way out of timber and plaster, one building was not demolished in Chicago and is still standing to this day.
And it's clearly not timber and plaster.
It is, yes, it is solid stone.
Which is more likely what the other buildings were made out of.
Yes.
Of course, we can't trust the narrative that they're giving us, so, fill in the blanks, people.
the next thing is an event that I attended myself. My parents drove me and my grandmother interstate when I was 8 years old to attend this one. This is, although the name is different, it's World Expo. It is the same thing as a World's Fair. And like, if you remember what the poster said from the Chicago World's Fair, it was the exhibition or exposition, and what's the word expo short for? Now, what do we have here? Just compare the quality of the structures here. Now, I remember I was there in person when I was 8 years old, and
those are some pretty tense, and
they're still tents.
Yeah,
and although we're so much more advanced now.
I'm sorry, but people can believe the pure and utter malarkey. I'm not gonna curse online here on our stream, but it's so ridiculous that people are convinced with this context in mind. It's almost as though we've been convinced that history doesn't matter, and we're not supposed to look at these things logically. We're just supposed to accept what they tell us about anything and everything before a time that our grandparents were alive.
The whole concept of this, for lack of a better term, I'll call it what it appears to be to me, is a soft reset of the development of human civilization. And there's evidence that there's been more than one. The most notable one is the flood of Noah, and that was a major reset. Although the biblical narrative has that, of course, it was Noah and his wife and 3 sons. This is one of the few images that's still available of a supposed timber and plaster structure being demolished.
Clearly, that's not timber and plaster.
Timber and plaster would have crumbled to matchsticks, basically, at that kind of angle and falling down the way it is.
And look at these primitive little humans trying to demolish it and failing miserably.
But one other thing that I haven't really mentioned is where the tip of that one is, it almost appears like it's leaning against the one on the right side of the frame, the building. You can kind of make it out on the top of that one, but more so on the top of the building on the left side is a significant number of these buildings had their spire in the shape of an angel. And you can clearly see that one that's kind of 2/3 of the way across, maybe 1/4 of the way across from the left-hand side. You can clearly see its wings, its robes, and in one arm it's holding up something. Now, what that is, from what I've seen, we didn't really have time to fit every single image in.
Try to zoom in here.
Some I've seen appear to be holding a cup. Some I've seen they're just holding a sphere, like a spherical object, which could be a representation of the world. I don't know. But I think there's also been some in which they're holding an object that almost looks like a pine cone, which is a correlation with images from Sumerian, Babylonian, and ancient South American stone carvings. But that's a little bit of a side note. Here's some images here that show some of the oldest standing city. Well, I can't remember which city this is, I'm sorry. But it's not an isolated example of cities that have been just almost like their entire lower half of all of their buildings buried in sediment, mud, and massive excavation projects have taken place.
So essentially, these people are reoccupying an already established ancient infrastructure.
It
that
definitely
preceded
appears
them.
that way.
And there's a lot of evidence about this.
Well, here's another. There's plenty of photos that can be found where the ground level goes right up to windows on the ground floor, and if you can go inside that building. To go inside that building, you have to go downstairs from the ground level. This one, you can kind of see there's a railing there going up in line with the street level.
And clearly that railing is not designed by the same people who built that
It
building.
doesn't match the structure at all.
No, it's kind of warped, and I'll try to zoom in here, but yeah, it's certainly not even a straight line, the railing there.
I think that might be deliberately part of the way it was built, but it definitely doesn't match the style of the rest of it.
Yeah, obviously it was built much later,
And
probably right along the same time as the sidewalk that was laid out there.
But this is another thing about this image, that look at the level of construction of those buildings. Look at the road.
It's mud.
It's, well, dirt at the very least.
Yeah,
unsealed roads.
So,
and
clearly
you can see by the track.
it.
Sorry.
Clearly they excavated it, right? I mean, that's
partially, yeah. In other areas where they could get away from it, there's a paved concrete by the look of, or some kind of stone solid sidewalk there. But the street itself, it doesn't make sense. That all of these materials that they would have had to have transported to these locations if those buildings were constructed after the streets were established, in the era that we're told they were built in, would have had to have been transported. And there's another one, and that's phenomenal. That you're going down below the apparent, massive excavation project there, and there's these foundations of these buildings that go down, and then there's pillars.
It looks like, if I could move the mouse pointer here, it looks like this part right here was actually where the street used to be.
Well, it does actually.
Like right at the base of these pillars.
Mm-hmm.
And these could have been the causeways or entranceways to this building, maybe even a former parking garage.
It's definitely not as elaborate a structure as some of the others we've seen. But there's definitely more going on with the architecture of many cities in the world than what we're being told.
And this is that image that we were showing earlier, just to add context to what we're talking about here. All across the globe, we're seeing the same thing again and again and again. Even similar types of construction that really don't seem to fit the cultures that surround them today.
Well, one of the things that I noticed, primarily with the architectural style of, and this is going back a little bit to something that we've already moved past, but the architectural style of the Chicago World's Fair is almost Roman.
Yeah, it certainly appears that way, doesn't it?
There's a distinct similarity to the style. It's hard to argue. And much of this, I admit, is still theory. There's images, but it's a theory supported by images that don't have the word I was after was that they don't correlate with the official narrative of what we're told the history of our civilization is. And this isn't the only example. It's not really a topic I intended to bring up today, but you did mention earlier Atlantis. And there's a channel on YouTube. I'm not going to try and take credit for the research myself because it wasn't my discovery, but a channel called Bright Insight. And the number of videos he's done showing different examples of evidence that the ruins of Atlantis are, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, but a structure in West Africa called the Reichardt structure, Richat, if anyone wants to look it up, also called the Eye of the Sahara. But if you look at it, and you can look it up on Google Earth, you look at this thing from above, it looks like an eye. But it's the mountain range to the north of it, for example. But even measuring it on, if you zoom right in on it, you can see there's concentric rings exactly matching what was described of Atlantis. And of course, all that's left is the foundation, really, an impression. But using the approximate measuring tool that is built into Google Earth, you can see that the measurements of the diameters of these rings and the measurement of the whole circular section of the eye itself closely, very closely match the dimensions given by Plato for the size of Atlantis.
Again, where was this located?
Western Africa.
Western Africa.
Yeah. But again, we all know the stories that Atlantis sank into the ocean, or was submerged.
Well, yeah, and there's also that story about an ancient advanced civilization. I believe Stan Lee wrote about it. Wakanda. He's a well-known historian who helps produce Hollywood movies. You might have seen the movie. It's called Black Panther. It kind of helps explain all of those ancient advanced structures in Africa. Wakanda.
I never made that connection, actually, between Wakanda and Atlantis.
It's sort of in a way, it kind of mocks a truth, it seems.
Yeah.
But
we see many examples of hints about ancient history being portrayed in modern movies.
That particular thing I think is a hint, but at the same time, it sort of veils over a profound truth that we're ignoring.
Well, we have also heard claims that all of Africa was at some point jungle. Mm-hmm. But if you look at northern and western Africa, that whole part of the continent, from a larger scale, you can actually see marks from what appears to be an enormous tsunami that has swept over that entire region of the continent.
Yeah.
It's either come up from the west and gone up that way, or it's come down from the north and swept.
Yeah. So it's really, I was being sarcastic earlier, obviously. For those of you who weren't aware, I was about Wakanda, but what I mean by that is that it's not hidden from us. It's plainly obvious that there certainly was an advanced ancient civilization, and there's a lot of names for it. I know that you wanted to display an image of one example of what they called it.
There is many different versions of the map. And like all nations, all empires, their borders vary over time. But on this one we can see some clear references to nations that geological locations that still exist in the modern world. You can see China, much smaller than we know it today. You can see Korea, Japan.
There's something I wanted to that I'm reminded of now when I'm looking at that giant wall around China. This is a fact that the ramparts on that wall are facing towards China, not towards Mongolia. So that totally disrupts the narrative that China was protecting itself from Mongolians, thus they built the Great Wall. On the contrary, it looks very much as though, according to this map, Tartaria was protecting itself from whomever was residing in China
at that time.
Yeah, merely by the way these walls were built.
Because the other thing, it's not just the defensive position, the ramparts, things like that. But the steepest slope is facing towards China as well to make it more difficult to climb.
So it seems the more advanced civilization, at least during the time when that wall was built, was north and west of China.
Yeah. It's, for whatever reason. Now, of course, when many people, when they discuss from their own perspective things to do with the World's Fair and the advanced structures all around the world, they will commonly refer to it as Tartaria.
Mm-hmm.
This is what was actually the nation of Tartaria, or the empire, whichever term really applies.
Mm-hmm.
But we see the same thing with Atlantis. Many people claiming that this place is where Atlantis was because they had this technology, or this place was Atlantis. And both can be true. And it's much the same as the Anunnaki Empire. The Anunnaki themselves are a race, as we've mentioned in another live stream that I was on. But there are also different planets within that empire that, although they are not of the same biological race as the Anunnaki themselves, they are acknowledged and accepted as a part of that empire. People that we would describe as humanoid type reptiles are one of the most prominently referred to. Then there's the second most referred to one is the Greys, is the most common colloquial term for them in the modern world. But they've got their own origin that is separate, but they're still part of the empire. But as an example on Earth, and there's a common saying, as above, so below. You see, Atlantis had its capital, which was the city of Atlantis itself, but there were settlements, so to speak. There we go.
Okay, so the audience doesn't see what we have up on the screen yet. Give a special shout out to Archbishop Jane Casson. Thank you for sharing this link. It's a reference point to something really profound, the phenomenon known as the Eye of the Sahara, evidence of an ancient civilization in North Africa today. We'll go ahead and bring that up. All right, so the audience can see what we're talking about here, brother.
Excellent, thank you. Now, from what I remember, there are different theories for how this formed. But the thing I'll bring up first is, see that bluish-white kind of bluish-white kind of deposit at the bottom left corner, or near the bottom left corner?
Okay, so let me scroll up a bit so the audience can see that there.
Just above my head. There's not just one spot for it, there's several scatterings of it, but all of that is sea salt.
Very interesting. So, okay, obviously there's varying degrees of sediment, there's varying degrees of advancement being displayed. It seems like what we're seeing is cyclical resets of humanity, even in between what we would expect.
And if you look at it from in a somewhat sequential order, they're decreasing in severity.
Interesting. And they're also at various levels less and less advanced than the civilization that preceded it. That's what it seems as though. Or maybe I couldn't say for sure, but we can assume, based on the history we're told, that about 2,000 years ago things were very primitive, and there must have been some degree of advancement since then, and then reset again, and then we had to not totally start over. But I mean, if you could imagine the level of advancement we're at now, that people today, for the most part, would come nowhere near the technology we have now if all of that infrastructure was taken from them, even briefly, like within a few months, we would be we would essentially be reset to early 1900s technology.
Yeah, a solar flare could do that in an instant.
Yeah.
One thing comes to mind right now is when all of these buildings were being stripped of their spires and domes and that kind of thing, that gave them the ability to essentially be antennas to extract this electric charge from the atmosphere. There was all of this was copper, and there would have been a lot of it essentially as a surplus. One of the key reasons that J.P. Morgan stripped the funding from Nikola Tesla for his work was because it would have had a negative impact on his copper sales. He was selling massive amounts of copper wire at the time.
And this brings us back to that Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison reference that we were talking about before, where it seems like economic motivations trump the
Definitely.
technological advancement motivations.
Things like pride and greed are the two biggest contributors to that kind of thing, and without them...
But underlying the pride and greed, it would seem that there's an ulterior motive even deeper than that. Yeah, control. And economy is used as a means of control.
Absolutely.
So when a form of energy is discovered that's freely floating in the air, there's not a whole lot of controls to be placed on that.
That's another argument made, that the other big reason that while J.P. Morgan was initially funding Tesla's work, he just, at some point, the argument is that J.P. Morgan discovered that there was no way to regulate how much people were using, or how much to charge them according to how much they were using. You couldn't put a meter on it effectively.
And it would be very easy to bypass that meter and just simply say, I'm not doing it. I'm not using it. Or by the way, this is a God-given right because it is freely provided by nature, and there's really no way to corrupt that form of energy the way they do our water supply or our food supply.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I think this is a point at which we should probably give our final words for the audience. What would you have to say for everyone at home?
I think the most important thing is, and this is one of my philosophies in life, it has been for decades, nothing is more important than the truth. And I'm not saying to need to believe everything that we've said in the last hour or so, but if you have the questions, look for the answers. Now, a verse from the Bible actually comes to mind, and unfortunately, as is often the case with me, I could never remember the exact chapter and verse, but it's something like, it is the glory of God to conceal the matter, but it's for the honor of kings to seek it out.
Very powerful statement, brother. Thank you. I want to read some words from our Vicar General, Cardinal Eric Logan. Thank you for talking to us in the chat and imparting these important words. He says, between Nibiru's passing and reset events like the Tower of Babel, just one example, we've got to wonder how many of these resets were natural versus engineered. And I would add to that even to say some were simply natural events allowed to happen, like what the flood of Noah we discussed on a previous episode.
It was a natural event that was allowed to happen.
Yep. And you can see evidence that we've displayed that certainly natural events were a part of the reset that happened most recently, and there's more to be revealed on future episodes. I hate to get you to bite your tongue on that because I know we could go on about this for another hour, but
yeah, I'm gonna have to.
Yeah.
There was just one thing I just remembered, which
ahead,
I really
brother.
want to bring up.
Go ahead.
There is maps of Chicago from the 1700s or earlier, where, and now this is going back to probably about the same time as Christopher Columbus landed, that show a city already, or a settlement of some sort, in the location of Chicago. It's written as a different name, slightly, and the name is Chilaga. Chilaga. But in those images, on that map, the Great Lakes are not there.
Interesting.
There is a river coming from the north, diagonally down, southwest. Basically going through the same terrain where the lakes are. But no lakes.
So clearly the landscape and the aquifers and all that
things have changed dramatically.
And it'll change again.
Oh yeah.
So what we see is North America and various other continents around the globe are going to be different after the next reset. And it's coming soon, people. Nibiru is passing again, the Nemesis system with it.
They're on approach now.
The Son of the Living God is here with us now. He's warned us about it. He's told us that their signs are here, that the Sun of Righteousness shall rise, and it has. And that's not just S-O-N, son. No, that's S-U-N, and that's written from Malachi 4:2. It's prophesied. We are in the times of the end, and things around us are just as in the times of Noah. Sudden destruction is coming. If it's not already at your doorstep, it's not far from you. And there's only one way in this world provided to you to repent, and that is through the Christ. As it has been for the last 2,000 years, there is no way unto the Father except by the Son, and the Son is returned. His name is, meaning the Word of God, his name is Rael. He is the King of Kings. He is the Lord of Lords. There's no other way unto the Father except by him. And instead of venerating through a false name, which is Jesus, recognizing the true name, which means salvation in Hebrew, Yeshua, and knowing that his true name, his new name, revealed, being the Word of God, Rael, is the name he goes by today. It's clearly a sign as to how and where you need to repent. So, with that, thank you for joining us, brother.
On that context, I would also like to add, repentance is, well, the first step to it is recognizing that we've done something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The second step is making a deliberate effort to change that and correct it. And there is no shame in that.
No, none whatsoever. And even from an intellectual standpoint, you would readily accept correction where you presented facts to the contrary.
Yeah.
And just the same, so should faith become within our hearts, that a logical perspective needs to be approached.
And it doesn't even need to just be a pure, just faith. It's also morals, morality, which is one of the most important things to take into account.
And that brings to mind the two main precepts under Lord Rael that he professes, those two.
Love God and love each other.
And that is the basis of all of his teachings. So really, there's no reason for people to be against him if they are morally upright people.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind, people, and may God bless you. We'll see you again soon, 11 a.m. Monday through Friday, 1 p.m. Monday through Friday, West Coast American time, 3 p.m. on Sundays. Thank you again, brother.
Thank you for having me.
Cardinal Matt Staader. May God bless you all in Lord Rael's name.